going to move on now to the sort of next stage of the agenda. So we're going to look at governance and intentional misrepresentation and boosting. So that's our second panel discussion. So this is going to be chaired by Andrea Petrosi, and also we've got Tom Nightingale and Ali Jawad on the panel.
Okay. I start with the admission. The program has changed so much over the past couple of days that I had to write and rewrite. I will not stick to my slides. And I also had to rewrite the beginning of my talk, possibly the entire talk, based on the conversation we had today. And I listened to the focus group yesterday for the athletes, I interviewed the athletes, and I listened to your discussion. Originally, I had that. Try to clean up a little bit of the definitions we have, because I think definitions matters, and these are important. And this is important because we are going to talk about governance. If we don't have a precise definition of what we are talking about, is we cannot set goals. And if we don't set goals clearly, we cannot assess whether we achieve them or not. So, my intention was about a week ago that I'm going to offer you a definition which I think works. It's out of question. Based on the conversation, it's not possible. So let me approach this from a different angle. Do we have chemists in the audience? No. That was what I was hoping for. So if you hear the word doping in a context of chemistry, what would you do? Anyone? You read a sentence, it says doping, doped material, in chemistry context. What do you do? Other than, I don't care. Let's assume that you try to understand. Come on. No one, no ideas.
You assume it's a sample that has been tested, or that there is evidence of doping?
Okay. Is anyone would actually just Google it? What does it mean? So actually, there is such a concept as doping in chemistry. So let me read, because I didn't memorize it, let me read the definition. So in doping in chemistry, it refers to the process by which they produce semiconductors. And it is an intentional introduction of impurity into an intrinsic semiconductor to modulate its electrical, optical, and structural properties. Does it resonate with doping? Yeah. The doped material is referred to as extrinsic semiconductor. The point I'm trying to make here is not that how much similarities is between doping in sport context and chemistry, but the point is, when I saw that first, I actually had to Google because I had no idea what it means in doping in chemistry context. But if we hear clean sport, fairness, integrity, vulnerability, attitude, that's one of my favorite, legitimacy, these are everyday words that we use in conversations. As layperson, we sort of intrinsically understand what it means. We may not be able to define it, but we sort of have an idea of what clean sport means. We don't have to Google it, which is all fine, but it's a problematic when we try to measure as a construct. It's a problematic when we try to set it as a goal. So I encourage the whole community is actually try to come up with operational definitions, because without that, we will not have good governance. So you saw some of the examples, I'm pretty sure that you read when I was talking. Clean sport can be fair sport if fair refers to the process. Clean sport monopolized by anti-doping, so if it means a drug-free sport, that has a different meaning. But generally, athletes in the previous focus groups in this project define clean sport as essentially not a drug-free sport, but it is a cheating-free sport, which opens up the door to all kinds of other infringements. So based on the literature review and past experience that we did, this is pretty much a non-exclusive list of the ways of, if you like, cheating or the threats against integrity. And I choose that deliberately, saying that it's a threat against integrity, because it includes issues such as sexual harassment, abuse, bullying, non-accidental violence or integration of trans and intersex athletes into, because that's part of sport integrity, it's not necessarily cheating. And then obviously there are the preference-related ways to cheat, which is using doping, we talked about, classification manipulation or intentional misrepresentations, we will discuss it extensively today again. The myth about the misuse and abuse of the TUE system. We don't have much evidence in terms of parasports, but we definitely know that in able-bodied sport it is a myth. Among the Olympic participants, the less than 1% has actually TUE, and it's practically not linked to the medal. That said, the myth is still there, that it's a common way to cheat the system. But then, if we open the door to cheating, we will have to start talking about competition manipulation, match fixing, spot fixing, not necessarily for financial gain, but gaining competitive advantage. And then we talk about unfair advantage via technology or apparel. And then finally, with the gruesome practice of boosting, which bordering on intentional self-harm. So just to keep in mind, and I hand it over to my panelists, and after that I will just moderate the discussion, hopefully, with your questions. Sticky notes, please. Keep that in mind, that if we open the door, which I'm not saying we shouldn't, but if we had opened the door and say, well, actually, what I should take on classification manipulation, because that's the other big issue. We open the door to all the others. We cannot say, yeah, we take on classification manipulation, but let's match fixing be someone else's problem. Let the other integrity issue someone else's problem. So we have to be careful about who is actually taking that job on and whether that organization, institution has the capability, the expertise, the skills, the knowledge, and the tools to actually tackle all of that. So with that in mind, I'm handing over to Tom first. So let's hear about boosting first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ian, for the invitation to chat today. So I guess I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. I'm not necessarily working at the coalface currently with Paralympic athletes. I'm a lecturer in exercise physiology, and I did my postdoctoral research training at the International Collaboration on Repair Discoveries with Dr. Andrei Krasiakov, or Dr. K. And you might have seen some of his blog posts around boosting in 2012 when it really sort of came to light. And so what is boosting, just starting off with this definition? Well, it's the intentional induction of autonomic dysreflexia in order to enhance performance. And this is commonly seen in individuals with an injury above the 6th thoracic level, but it has been reported in cases down to the 10th thoracic level as well. The clinical definition of this condition is an increase in systolic blood pressure by more than 20 millimeters of mercury, and that's above the baseline value. So the important thing is you have to measure a baseline based on the clinical definition. So sort of the pathophysiology of AD, what triggers it, and there are multiple triggers, and the individuals themselves are often the expert in what triggers AD for them in each instance. And these can include, but they're not limited to, bladder distension, injury, or an innocuous stimulus. So this could be something as simple as a tight shoelace or a tight belt below their level of injury. And what this causes is this visceral somatic trigger, which causes this reflex, this sympathetic reflex, leading to vasoconstriction in the blood vessels in the lower extremity or in the trunk. This is detected by baroreceptors in the aortic arch. The body tries to mount a parasympathetic response, but ultimately these inhibitory signals from the brain to prevent this hypertensive crisis can't get through the injury site, and what we see is that blood pressure remains elevated. And until you remove that stimulus, blood pressure will remain elevated, or unless you use a pharmacological intervention as well. So the physiological responses is this vasoconstriction in the blood vessels, increased blood pressure. We see this increased cardiac contractility, and increase in circulating catecholamines as well. And all of these factors can increase performance in aerobic sporting events. Bit of a shameless plug here, and you'll see on the tables that we've put an infographic around. I was fortunate enough to contribute towards this. We had no funding for the project, and a few people today have talked about education. And this is behind a paywall of a journal, so by putting it on the tables, hopefully you can read about boosting and get that information. And of course, come and speak to me, and you can have my email, and I'll give you the PDF copy as well. So that is boosting in and of a nutshell, that induction of autonomic dysreflexia to get a performance benefit. Now, why is it a problem? The first one is that it's dangerous. So if you're not able to act quickly and remove that stimulus, in very severe cases of AD, this can lead to sort of seizures, stroke, or even death. It is rare in athletes, but what we don't know, and we don't have the data around, is if people are performing boosting during competition, during training, and also experiencing this in everyday life, what is the long-term health consequences for Paralympic athletes as they then move into retirement and in older age as well? The next aspect is this performance benefit, and I think you would agree that in elite sport, anything that can elicit a 7 to 10% improvement in performance is quite a large performance benefit. And then the last thing is that it's actually really challenging to measure this as well. So currently, what was done by the IPC is that susceptible athletes, those with injuries above T6, are tested before the competition. If their blood pressure, systolic blood pressure, is above 160 millimeters of mercury, they're retested 10 minutes later. And if this is again elevated, the case is going to be reviewed, and he or she might be disqualified from the competition. Also, if there's an athlete is caught trying to intentionally induce autonomic dysreflexia, that can then lead to the IPC generating a report from the Legal and Ethical Committee for review as well. Now, despite this perceived prevalence of boosting in the Paralympic community, to date, no athlete has been disqualified. But we do have some data from across multiple Paralympic Games where the highest measured systolic blood pressure was 178 millimeters of mercury. But this was when a previous IPC threshold was being used of 180 millimeters of mercury. So if that athlete was tested today, then that case would be considered as boosting. And just using this slide really to sort of highlight some of the complexities on how this is difficult to measure. So this is some data that we had in the lab with one individual with a cervical injury. They performed cardiopulmonary exercise tests to exhaustion across multiple days. And what you see in red was without autonomic dysreflexia. Blood pressure in this individual was around 98 systolic before taking part in the exercise bout. Slight increase at the end. So these are these are the blue squares. But the participant tested before exercise, blood pressure was really low. And we're performing this test. The participant ends up going on for another 2 stages of the test, a huge increase in their peak power output, and an increase in their max heart rate as well. So we ended the test, tested blood pressure. You can see this dramatic increase up to 158 millimeters of mercury systolic blood pressure, but that's a massive difference in this one individual. It would have been missed because by boosting, by definition, is this intentional induction of autonomic dysreflexia happening before the event. So that was one reason, but also it's not gone across that threshold for the single discrete measurement for being indicative of boosting. So just wanted to put that there to give a flavour to some of the complexities that you have in identifying this condition.
Thank you. Yes, this one. Ali, would you like to say a brief introduction about the classification? Anything that we have not covered before, or we are all good?
We've covered a lot today about classification. I think from my point of view, there's actually more prevalent studies on boosting than there is classification manipulation, even though it's a minority of para-athletes that can actually utilise that. So obviously, it's actually quite worrying that research hasn't attempted to kind of think about intentional misrepresentation. I think from my view, it's fascinating that it's hard to measure and it can happen naturally, but also with classification, that's also natural because you're relying on the athlete to pretty much be very, very honest in the classification process for them to be classified. So actually the two are very relatable, but with hardly any sort of robust regulations in place.
Thank you. Well, my question is for really both practices are, what is the root cause of the problem? Is that athletes are doing it because they decided that this is a good idea, or actually there is the support mechanism around them who facilitate these practices, whether it's classification, manipulation, or the boosting?
I think with classification, I don't think para-athletes do it by themselves. I've seen many cases where coaches encourage athletes to try and manipulate the classification system, knowing that it's not robust enough to pick up on the effort of the athlete. I think that's quite dangerous because we know with doping as well, athletes don't do it by themselves, that they've got a team around them. And I think with para-athletes under a lot of pressure to, one, perform, but two, make sure they've got a competitive advantage to stay on that team. So I think it's really hard because, especially with young athletes, you're going to listen to your coach. They think you think they're right, when in fact actually they're telling you to manipulate your impairment, and then you actually realise 10, 15 years down the line what you did. So I guess for me it's actually getting that culture right within that team when it comes to classification and not manipulating the system.
Yeah, and I think relating to boosting, I'm not necessarily aware of any, as I mentioned then, that the athletes themselves or the individual with the spinal cord injury are probably their own experts in triggers and what will trigger autonomic dysreflexia. I don't necessarily think it would be something that would be, well, I hope is not something promoted by coaches and support staff, given that there's quite a considerable safety aspect involved with inducing AD, and it is something that such a transient condition can be life-threatening. Blood pressure can rise up to more than 300 millimeters of mercury in some cases, which obviously puts quite a strain on blood vessels throughout the human body. But I think sort of the historic data that we have on the performance effects of boosting was more historical studies where perhaps ethics boards might have been a little bit less, I don't want to say the word rigorous, and the recent cases that we have in the literature are more episodes that have occurred during testing. So by nature, it's not that the athlete has intentionally induced AD, it's just developed during the course of the exercise performance where they were being assessed. So there's not a great deal of studies really assessing boosting in Paralympic athletes for us to get that information. But I think whether the coaches are involved or the support staff is something that I don't think we know, or at least I'm not aware.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with, because the session is about governance, so let's start with boosting. If we try to, at the moment, boosting is, my understanding, is regulated as a health issue. So athletes are checked before the race, and if they are not in a physical healthy conditions to compete, they are not allowed to compete, but there are no further consequences associated with that in general. I think technically it's possible, but it's not. Correct?
But there hasn't been so far.
Yeah, it hasn't been so far. So, if we want to change that system, what should we do? Should it be part of the prohibited practices under the WADA code? Or we find a different regulation? So what should we do with this?
Well, for me, I think it goes back to, we've heard a lot of stuff today around sort of testing and the finances and who will be doing what, but I think as a physiologist going back to it, that a single discrete measurement of blood pressure pre-exercise I don't think is a very sensitive measure. And so I think you would need a battery of autonomic tests to identify people that have the sort of, or could be predisposed to boosting, and that would then involve doing an exercise test to exhaustion, seeing what happens with heart rate, perhaps doing an orthostatic challenge to see what happens with blood pressure, sympathetic skin response test, monitoring over a period of perhaps 24 hours or a number of weeks to sort of, akin to what you see with sort of a blood doping passport with EPO and hematocrit, that if you could take multiple measurements over a period of time, it would be nice to sort of understand what the baseline is for that athlete, rather than just simply relying on the pre-competition 160 millimeters of mercury before they compete. But there's a lot of resources and funding potentially involved in that to do all of it. So the governance piece then becomes sort of, yes, over to you guys, who regulates that is, I guess, a question for you.
Ali, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think I said it before that currently we have to utilize what we have, because it's a lot of resource, even though it's probably the most optimal way of doing it. I think the IPC are always going to say we haven't got the resource to do it. So I think, how do we optimize our tests right now? And yeah, blood pressure isn't the most effective method. However, we can utilize it in a way that kind of the blood biological passport is utilized, where we potentially measure athletes' blood pressure over time and track it to see whether or not, away from competition, they are potentially boosting in training. It might not be optimal, but it'll be cost effective, and you've actually got data about if it boosts, how much boosting actually occurs. And also, because there's no sample collected, it's just data, so there'll be no expense when it comes to storing that sample. But I do understand that it's probably not the most optimal way, but I guess sometimes you have to utilize what you got without the funding there. But no, you're right, there needs to be way more investment into an optimal method.
Okay, so let's assume that the investment is made and we can test for that. What do you think should be the sanction for that? If there is an intentional attempt to boost, should it carry the same sanction as a doping offense?
Well, that's where it then becomes a bit tricky, because let's take, for example, someone that's going into competition, they have an accident at home and they burn their foot. They would then compete with heightened blood pressure, potentially, if that was the trigger for AD. Did they mean to do that? No. And so it's how do you then process that? I think because it happens quite frequently in everyday life for people with an injury above T6, so AD can happen up to 11 times per day. I think proving that it is an intentional act which could then be regulated is also really difficult to potentially manage or govern.
Okay, Ollie, your thoughts?
I think you're going to have to catch them in the act for them to get, for me, they should get a standard 4-year ban like anti-doping. I think it should be consistent across the board, but you're going to have to catch them in the act in order for you to prove without a reasonable level of doubt. But nobody's ever really been caught into actually doing it. I know there's chaperones sometimes in the call rooms to check on the athletes, but nobody's actually been caught that way.
Yes, I mean, I guess if you are catching someone, so there is anecdotal data of people potentially self-harming, maybe breaking a toe. If you witness that pre-competition, then yeah, you could be pretty confident perhaps that that's an intentional act. But if you get doing it based on a single blood pressure, you have no indication that they were intentionally trying to raise their blood pressure. That could just be the part of the condition of having that level of spinal cord injury.
I mean, understanding the complexity, and I'm not arguing that how difficult it is to prove intentional. I just want to point out that the intention under the WADA code is neither here or there. There is not required to prove intention as long as the effect is there. Okay, let's move to the classification.
So I think you're right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
with anti-doping, it's literally the athlete's responsibility. Doesn't matter if it's intentional or not, and you still get a ban. I think the issue is that we've got a health condition here that can happen at any time. Imagine saying to an athlete, you're going to get banned because you had an episode that wasn't your fault. and you can't prove it either way, that's where the grey area is. And that's where you're putting athletes' careers on the line because you've got some scientists saying that you've done it on purpose. It's very, very grey. It's going to be very difficult to be able to implement the kind of anti-doping rules into boosting, especially the regulations. So I fully understand just how difficult it might be.
Okay, so the question is, what can we do? Do we need to do anything? Is it a concern?
Yeah, I think the health consequences means it's a massive concern potentially. I think, like I say, we don't have a great deal of human data about the long-term effects of autonomic dysreflexia, but at least in sort of animal models of spinal cord injury, yeah, you get fibrotic changes in the brain, cognition impairments in the rats. I think, yeah, it comes back to an investment of, I think, funding from a researcher perspective to understand more about that condition and perhaps how it is used. I think we don't necessarily know the prevalence of boosting in Paralympic athletes. I think there was a 2009 survey, but you know, so 50% of people were aware of what boosting was. 27% thought that their athletes were doing it, and then asked if they were doing it, only 12% said that they had boosted previously. But yeah, I think just data, and maybe that's just me as a researcher wanting to try and investigate these things a little bit more. But yeah.
So is it a fair summary to conclude that part before we move on to the classification? Is apart from, yes, we need more data, we need more research, we need more funding, but it's in the right place in terms of governance that treat it as a health condition, we just have to do a bit better.
Yeah, I think the potential for the integration of that blood pressure passport would be potentially a step forward. Because what I didn't say is it's not that everyone with an injury above T6 will have autonomic dysreflexia. Like, spinal cord injury is this heterogeneous condition that, you know, if it's an autonomically incomplete injury, then they might not. So this then potentially comes into classification a little bit, in that if you took two people with the same T2 injury, but someone is autonomically incomplete and they can increase their heart rate to 180 beats per minute versus someone that is complete and they can only increase their heart rate to 130 beats per minute, well, that's a huge performance difference potentially, but is autonomic testing routinely done with classification? Potentially a missing piece of the puzzle. So I think just firstly raising awareness around autonomic function, and then perhaps having discussions around how it could be implemented and if it's feasible to do a blood pressure passport in that population group.
Yeah, so we're talking about the feasibility of the passport. I think you could definitely have blood pressure as part of the anti-doping process, because, yeah, again, there's no sample and just blood pressure, right? So you can collect somebody's urine in their blood and just measure them for blood pressure at the same time. It's not that difficult to actually put in if you really want to, and actually create a passport that way. The issue is that who does that, and then who's in charge of it? Because you've got anti-doping plus boosting, then you've got two organisations kind of coming together. So, yeah, like, even though there's a lot of discussion to be had, I think you can actually include blood pressure in the process of anti-doping protocols to make sure you actually collect that data.
Yes, thank you. Conscious of the time, let's move on to the classification. And I'm not going to go through the same discussions that we had before in a panel and again and again. So I will just have one question, and then after that I try to hand it over to the audience. Hopefully you have burning questions. Is it a possible scenario that we actually did a good job with anti-doping, made doping riskier and difficult? It is much, much easier and less risk-free or less risky to cheat with the classification manipulation.
Yes, it is risk-free because, as I said, you're not injecting anything. There's no long-term health issues, and you can dictate how much kind of pressure you kind of how much intent you apply to something, and that's why I think monitoring of their measurements is really important. So, yeah, again, a classification passport would be amazing, just to see the variability in how athletes kind of function year on year. but also do it in an environment where it's the norm for them and not competition. Because, you know, it's a bit like anti-doping, right? You can't let an athlete know you're coming because they might do everything to try and get things out of their system. So why is it different for classification? You're telling somebody when they're going to get classified. So they're going to try to do everything they can to try and go, actually, I want to be really tied for that classification. So I think, yeah, the classification passport is really interesting, but I also think out of competition classification it should be really considered. Yet again, it's who does that, how is that done, and if there's going to be a structure in place of what is the cost. I don't know what the costs are of classification, because I've only been through it once in my life, and that was quite easy.
Thank you. Tom, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Ali covered most of what I would have added to that.
Okay, thank you.
As the classification expert on the panel, you did a great job.
I wouldn't say an expert.
Thank you. Let's see if we have questions from the audience. Well, no competition, so Martin, it's yours.
Hi. So, in the work that you presented this morning, one of the comments from the focus groups, the athlete focus groups around boosting, was that perhaps it's less of an integrity issue, or should be considered less of an integrity issue and more of a safeguarding issue, because you're actually harming yourself to get performance. You know, that goes way beyond just trying to make performance enhancing substances. So, what do you?
Absolutely, yeah. It's weird because obviously, me kind of being in parasport, I always thought about boosting as cheating. But as a researcher, I've had to really take a step back and go, actually, you've got a welfare issue here. You've got athletes potentially harming themselves to get an advantage, or athletes that this naturally happens to. So imagine at a games where an athlete could really suffer. It could be a huge headache in terms of what happens with the public, in terms of if that ever happens. So there needs to be things in place to protect the athletes at all costs. The issue is that when it comes to education, we don't get boosting education as athletes. We don't get classification education as athletes. So there needs to be a way where you actually educate the athletes on the dangers of boosting, and making sure they actually understand that if they're having an episode, you report it straight away rather than actually compete with it, because you really don't want an incident during a games.
Yeah, and I think that would be the IPC stance as well, from the sort of the duty of care and safety perspective, as to why they avoid having would avoid, if there hasn't been any in competition as of yet that I'm aware of, but preventing them from performing that activity in a disreflexive state. So.
Thank you. Do we have other questions?
See if I can articulate this as best I can. Sort of maybe a counterpart to you, Martin. You mentioned that, so on one extreme you have pretty gruesome types of ways to boost, like breaking toes, etc. But in other cases you have very innocuous type, wearing a tight belt. And based off of animal models, you're saying there could be long-term health consequences. But in the short term, it doesn't appear to be. And therefore, based off the water code, would that then mean that you'd have to then push further about it being an issue of the spirit of sport rather than it being an issue of harm?
Great question. So just caveat that yeah, there could be an acute episode, if uncontrolled, is a medical emergency. So yeah, it is dangerous and has been reported events of people dying as a result of a single ongoing AD episode. So, I mean, I guess I didn't mention the performance benefits for the individuals, that these people with the high-level spinal cord injury have a low resting blood pressure, and a common symptom of that, I suppose, is fatigue. So by inducing autonomic dysreflexia, yes, you're getting the physiological benefits, but you're also feeling more alert and aware as well. That has the knock-on consequence on performance. But yes, it's potentially an acute episode in and of itself can be very dangerous as well. It's not that repetitive exposure over a period of time. Hope I answered your question, but I might have missed a part of it.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that, and I've had this discussion with others in the past, is that there's some forms of ways to increase blood pressure that we see being used in able-bodied sport. such as wearing a tight belt, slapping of individuals to get them emotionally aroused. And so, you know, you have this outcome measure being increased blood pressure, systolic pressure by 20 millimeters. To what extent is, see the best way to say this, if we see it being used in able-bodied sport and it's not being regulated, then why should it be used in parasports, with the caveat that, you know, when we talk about spinal injuries, it might be a little bit different, but generally amongst all athletes.
If I can jump into that, because there's a burning question along that side, and thank you very much for this intervention, is every time I hear about the classification manipulation, I think of weight category sports when it's considered strategy to lose weight before competition, dropping down, and it's an accepted practice in able-bodied sport. So if you can answer the two questions together, that some practices are common in able-bodied sport, but we are genuinely concerned about that in parasports. So why is that?
Oh, they're good questions. So I think from my point of view, you see a lot, elite sport isn't healthy. It isn't. Some of the strategies that are used to get into some classes, like bodyweight classes, are not safe, right? So we need to potentially have a system that allows that educates the athletes to live in a way that is safer for them to function, because I've seen some incredible things about athletes getting to bodyweight. I can't believe they even managed it and still competed. But also that's a health issue, right? And that's not even regulated. So when it comes to somebody's health, we need to make sure that the rules that are in place to make sure that athletes are penalized for that, for them strategies of getting down to bodyweight or potentially with boosting. So for example, in my sport, only recently, the IPC have decided that there'll be a 24-hour weigh-in, and then they're allowed to weigh you again within that 24 hours before competition. And if you're over body weight, you're out, because they're encouraging you to live a lifestyle of making weight healthily. So we need to have things in place by the system to help the athletes change their behaviors, is how I'm going to answer that.
Tom?
And well, I guess just to pick up the back end of that question, because I'm not sure I got to it, I think the difference between those practices done in able-bodied sport and then translating it to autonomic dysreflexia, that, you know, AD is far less predictable, and, you know, you might be able to better safely regulate or control by doing those practices in able-bodied than someone with a spinal cord injury, in that, you know, some of the early studies where people boosted and then were tested, I think a very small percentage said that they were able to reliably induce AD and predict how they'd respond. In some cases, it could be unsafe and they would need to initiate sort of the pharmacological intervention to get blood pressure under control. So it is this sort of reflexive state where we probably don't have the control. So that's why it's more of a safety and a concern in that population group in comparison to able-bodied sport. I think I covered that part of the question.
Okay, thank you. As a closing question from me to both of you, we spent today quite a bit of time talking about classification. Now boosting received due attention. Is there anything else on the radar that has performance benefits and regulatory bodies should be aware of?
Good question. I suppose we don't have all afternoon, but I just focus on one, which you might have seen the headlines around sort of epidural stimulators and spinal cord stimulation being paired with activity-based rehab, and some amazing stories of people with motor complete paralysis being able to walk again. Currently, there's around 40 people in the world with spinal cord injury and these stimulators implanted, but it's probably not too far a stretch to think in the future that as this procedure develops, we might see athletes competing with epidural stimulators, and to what extent they could be, you know, how are they regulated? Because we have some nice data showing that by turning on the stimulator, we can increase blood pressure by 15 millimeters of mercury. It's safe, and that's reliable across multiple testing visits, so it's not the classification of autonomic dysreflexia. And we saw anywhere between a 17 to 26% performance benefit. And to put that into context, just simply by turning on this device, that's anywhere between sort of 6 weeks to 6 months worth of exercise for someone with a cervical spinal cord injury. So, in that acute single period, just by turning it on. And to what extent then, when you have athletes with epidural implants, how might you want to consider regulating that in the future? But I would caveat that that's, at the moment, case report and case series data. So again, as I've said a lot today, probably more evidence and more funding and more research into that area. But just thought I'd raise it, given that it seems quite topical at the moment.
Thank you. I ask you to look into the future. So, Ollie, what's on your list?
Probably an easy one. Probably like technical doping. I think it'll be very interesting to see what countries come up with in the future and how the IPC regulate it. Because at the moment, you've got a big gap. So I wonder if the IPC implements something to try and close that gap when it comes to equipment used by nations. Because eventually we're going to have, well, we've already had Paralympians try to compete at the Olympics because their equipment has allowed them to. So, we might have more athletes that are wanting to bridge over. So it'll be very interesting to see how equipment develops over, 10, 15, 20 years' time.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we used up the time we had. So thanks for the panelists. Thank you, Ali, for doing that again. You have been a star today.
Sorry.
Thank you.